My daughter looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Dad, I did this because I love you." She said it with the particular sincerity of someone who has rehearsed the sentence enough times that it has come to feel true. I know what that sounds like. In 35 years of selling insurance, I sat across from thousands of people who were telling the truth and thousands who were not, and the ones who were not had usually spent enough time with their version of events that they could no longer fully distinguish it from what had actually happened. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the document she had placed on the table between us. The property transfer agreement for the house in Cambria, the house on the bluff above the Pacific that my wife Elena and I had bought in 1998 and where we had spent every August for 24 years, and where Elena had painted the watercolors that hung in every room of our house in Fresno. I looked at the notary stamp in the lower right corner of the document, the date beside it. I said, "Nikki, I was in Seattle on this date." She said, "Dad." I said, "I was at your cousin Maria's wedding. You were there. 300 people were there. There is a photograph of the two of us standing outside the church at 11 in the morning on this exact date." She did not say anything. I said, "The notary certified this document at 9:45 in the morning. I was on a plane." What happened in the next 4 minutes was not what she had expected. What she had expected was a conversation about love and family and what was best for everyone. What she got was a man who had spent 35 years in a business built entirely on the careful examination of documents and the identification of the precise moment when what a document claimed and what had actually happened stopped being the same thing. This is the story of what happens when a daughter forgets that her father has been reading the fine print his entire life. My name is Pedro Reyes. I am 68 years old. I was born in Fresno, California, the third son of a Mexican-American farm labor contractor who had built a small but legitimate business connecting agricultural workers with growers in the San Joaquin Valley and who understood, better than anyone I have ever met, that the difference between a handshake and a contract was the difference between a promise and a fact. My father did not distrust people. He simply understood that memory is unreliable and that goodwill is not permanent, and that the only protection against both of those realities is a written record that says clearly and specifically what was agreed, and when, and by whom. I started Reyes Insurance in 1987 with a licensed desk in a shared office on Fulton Street in downtown Fresno, a telephone, and the conviction that the people in my community were underinsured in ways that left them catastrophically exposed to risks they did not fully understand. I was right about that. I spent the first 5 years building a client base among small business owners and families in the Central Valley who needed someone who understood both the insurance products and the specific circumstances of their lives. By the time I sold the agency 12 years ago to a regional brokerage, Reyes Insurance had 11 licensed agents, a commercial lines division, a life and health division, and a client retention rate that the acquiring firm described as exceptional. I sold for enough to retire without concern. Elena passed 3 years ago. Breast cancer, a recurrence after 8 years of remission. She was 64 years old and we had been married for 40 years, and she had been the person who made every version of my life make sense, who could look at a complicated situation and see the essential truth of it before I had finished describing it. After Elena passed, I stayed in the house on Maple Avenue in Fresno where we had lived for 30 years. I kept the house in Cambria because I could not imagine letting it go. Elena had loved that house with the particular intensity of someone who has found a place that fits the specific shape of their inner life. The light in the mornings, the sound of the ocean at night, the garden she had planted along the south side of the property that bloomed every spring in colors she had chosen with the same deliberate care she brought to her watercolors. I have 2 children. My son Marcus lives in Sacramento and calls every Sunday and visits 4 times a year with a reliability that reflects the particular kind of love that shows itself through consistency. He is steady and honest, and he has his mother's gift for seeing things clearly. My daughter Nikki is 41 years old. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband Daniel and their 2 children, and she has, since Elena passed, been the child who calls most frequently and visits most often and expresses the most concern about my well-being. I have appreciated this. I want to be clear about that. I appreciated it even after I began to understand that not all of it was what it appeared to be. The first the first sign came 14 months after Elena passed, on a Sunday afternoon in November, when Nikki drove up from Los Angeles with Daniel and the children for what she described as a family lunch. We ate well. The children played in the backyard. Daniel was pleasant and attentive in the way he usually was, which is to say genuinely but not entirely present, as though a portion of his attention was always reserved for some other calculation. I had noticed this quality in Daniel for the 12 years he and Nikki had been married and had never found it alarming, only slightly opaque. After lunch, the children went inside and Daniel stepped onto the back porch and Nikki and I were alone at the table with coffee. She said, "Dad, I've been thinking about the Cambria house." I said, "What about it?" She said, "It's a lot to maintain from a distance. The property management costs money every month and you're only there in August and maybe a few weekends. It seems like a lot of overhead for the use you're getting." I said the house had appreciated significantly and that the carrying costs were manageable. She said, "I know, but Daniel thinks there might be a smarter structure. If we put the house in a family LLC, it would simplify the management and start the transition for when—" She paused. "For long-term planning purposes." I said I would think about it. She said, "Daniel has a contact at a real estate attorney's office who could walk us through the options." I said I preferred to consult my own attorney on anything related to property. After they left, I sat in the kitchen on Maple Avenue. I thought about what Nikki had said and specifically about the pause before long-term planning purposes. In 35 years of insurance, I had listened to people describe their situations in ways designed to make certain facts easier to raise. You learn to hear what is not being said. What the pause had contained was the word death. I called my attorney the following morning. "I want to tell you about Nikki because understanding her matters to understanding what happened and why. Nikki is 41 years old and she is, in most of the ways that count, a genuinely good person. She is warm and capable and she loves her children with the fierce attentiveness of someone for whom family is the organizing principle of her life. She has Elena's eyes and my stubbornness and a combination of both their gifts for persuasion that she has deployed professionally as a marketing executive in Los Angeles. She is also married to Daniel, who works in real estate development and who has spent 12 years in a business that requires the ability to identify undervalued assets and find ways to acquire them at advantageous terms. Daniel looks at property the way I look at insurance policies, which is to say as documents that contain specific provisions that can be structured to produce specific outcomes. The Cambria house, which Elena and I had bought for $340,000 in 1998, was valued at approximately $2.1 million. It sat on a bluff above the Pacific on a half-acre lot with an ocean view that the Cambria market had been treating with increasing seriousness for the previous decade. Daniel knew this. He had mentioned the appreciation of the Cambria market to me twice in the 3 years since Elena's death, framing it as general market commentary. I had received it as such, and had not connected it to anything until the Sunday lunch conversation. After I called my attorney, I began connecting it to things. My attorney's name was Carmen Villanueva. She had handled the sale of Reyes Insurance and had prepared my will when Elena passed. She was 55 and precise, and she told me exactly what she thought without softening it. I told her about the Sunday lunch conversation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Pedro, what does the Cambria property title look like currently?" I told her, "Solely in my name." She said, "And your current will?" I told her, "The house was to be divided equally between Nikki and Marcus upon my death." She said, "So Nikki stands to inherit 50% of a $2 million property." I said, "Yes." She said, "And Daniel is in real estate development." I said, "Yes." She said, "Pedro, pull your property records for Cambria and look at whether anything has been recorded against the property in the last 18 months. I looked that evening. It took 11 minutes. What I found was a recorded document, filed 7 months earlier, described as a statement of beneficial interest. The document claimed that Nikki Reyes Hoffman had a 50% beneficial ownership interest in the Cambria property based on a written agreement executed between Pedro Reyes and Nikki Reyes Hoffman at the time of Elena Reyes's passing. I had executed no such agreement. The document bore a notary stamp. The date beside the stamp was a Saturday in June of the previous year. I sat at my desk in the study and looked at that date for a long time. Then I opened the photo application on my phone and searched for June of the previous year. On the Saturday in question, I had been in Seattle at the wedding of my nephew Marcus Jr. There were 400 photographs beginning on the Friday evening and running through the Sunday morning. I was in approximately half of them. The ceremony had been on Saturday morning. I was in the front row. The time stamp on the photographs began at 9:12 in the morning. The notary had certified the document at 9:45. I called Carmen. She said, "How certain are you about Seattle?" I said, "There are 400 photographs. I have the airline boarding pass in my email. I have the hotel receipt. I have a text from Marcus at 8:50 that morning saying he could see me through the church window." Carmen said, "Pedro, this is a forged notarization." I said, "I know what it is." She said, "This changes things significantly." I said, "Yes, it does. Carmen, I need to know the full shape of this before I do anything. How much time do I have?" She said, "Nothing can move against the property without either your signature or a court order. You have time." I said, "Start." What Carmen built over the following 3 weeks was careful and thorough. She engaged a forensic document examiner named Robert Park, who had spent 20 years as an expert witness in real estate fraud cases. Robert reviewed the beneficial interest declaration and prepared a written report establishing 3 specific problems. The first problem was the date, which placed me in Seattle when I was provably elsewhere. Robert confirmed the notary stamp was genuine, but that the document had been backdated to create a false impression of when the agreement had been made. The second problem was the signature. Robert compared it to 15 other samples of my signature and identified 6 specific characteristics that were inconsistent. A competent forgery, not a perfect one. The third problem was the language, which described the agreement as made at the time of Elena's passing and claimed I had recognized Nikki's beneficial interest as compensation for her estate management role. The Cambria property had not been part of any estate proceedings and would not have been subject to any such arrangement. Then Carmen found the lien. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice had the particular quality it had when she was delivering something she had confirmed more than once before saying it out loud. She said, "Pedro, there's a mechanic's lien, filed 4 months ago by a contractor claiming unpaid work on the Cambria property, $68,000 in alleged unpaid services. The contractor is a company registered in Nevada called Pacific Coastal Improvements, LLC. The registered agent for the company is Daniel Hoffman." I was quiet for a long moment. Through the window of my study, I could see the backyard on Maple Avenue, the raised beds Marcus had built for Elena, empty now as they had been for 3 years. I said, "He filed a lien against my property using a company he controls." Carmen said, "Yes, and I've pulled the records. No permit was ever filed for any work at the Cambria address during the period the lien covers. No contractor's license exists under that company name in California. The work the lien claims was performed does not appear to have been performed." I said, "So it's a fraudulent lien?" She said, "It is a lien that cannot be substantiated." "Yes," she continued. "The lien combined with the beneficial interest claim creates a legal encumbrance that would complicate any sale or refinancing of the Cambria property. The combination creates a very specific kind of leverage." I said, "Leverage for what?" She said, "For a negotiated transfer. If you wanted to sell the property or use it as collateral for any purpose, you would need to clear both encumbrances first. The most efficient way to clear them would be to negotiate directly with the holders of each encumbrance, who are, in both cases, your daughter And your son-in-law. I sat with that for a moment. The full shape of it was becoming visible. I said, "They built a trap." Carmen said, "Yes, and they built it carefully over a period of at least 8 months. But they made one mistake." I said, "The date." She said, "The date." Nikki called me on a Thursday evening and said she and Daniel were going to be in Fresno the following Saturday and wondered if they could come for lunch. She said there were some things she wanted to discuss about Cambria. I said, of course. I said I would make lunch. I spent Friday preparing 2 things. The lunch, which I made carefully because Elena had always believed that how you fed people told them something true about how you felt about them. I made the rice the way she had made it, with the sofrito and the bay leaves and the particular proportion of liquid to grain that I had watched her adjust over 40 years until it was exactly right. I made the chicken the way she had taught me after her mother taught her. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones we used for occasions that deserved them. The folder was the second thing. Carmen had assembled it in a specific order. Robert Park's forensic report on top, 22 pages, with the key findings tabbed in red. Behind it, the recording history from the county recorder's office showing the 3 documents filed through Daniel's title services company, with the dates highlighted. Behind that, the Nevada Corporation registration showing Daniel as registered agent for Pacific Coastal Improvements, LLC. Behind that, the California Contractors State License Board records showing no license existed under that name. Carmen had added a cover page that summarized the entire picture in 8 sentences. I read it twice on Friday evening and once more on Saturday morning. They arrived at noon. Daniel was carrying a folder of his own, which he set on the side table near the door when he came in, which told me they had come prepared for a different version of this conversation than the one they were going to have. Just the 3 of us. We ate at the dining room table and talked about ordinary things, and I watched my daughter across the plates, and I thought about how much she looked like Elena around the eyes and how much I loved her and how those 2 facts did not change. What I needed to do. After lunch, I cleared the table. I made coffee. I brought the folder and placed it on the table. Nikki looked at the folder. She looked at Daniel. Something passed between them. I sat down. I said, "Nikki, I found the beneficial interest declaration." She said, "Dad?" I said, "I found it 6 weeks ago. I have spent 6 weeks understanding it completely before saying a word to you." Daniel said, "Pedro, there's an explanation." I said, "Daniel, I will speak with my daughter first." He was quiet. I said, "The document is dated the Saturday of Marcus Jr.'s wedding. I was in Seattle. I was in the front row of the church. There are 400 photographs and a boarding pass and a hotel receipt and a text from your brother at 8:50 that morning. The notary certified the document at 9:45. She did not say anything. I reached into the folder. I slid Robert Park's forensic report across the table. I slid the recording history showing the 3 documents filed through Daniel's title services company. I slid the Nevada Corporation registration showing Daniel as registered agent for the company that had filed the mechanic's lien. I said, "I know about the lien. I know about the title company. I know what this structure was designed to accomplish." Nikki said, "Dad, I did this because I love you." I looked at my daughter. I held her gaze for a long moment. I said, "The notary's date says otherwise." A silence. She said, "I was scared. Daniel said if something happened to you and we didn't have something in writing, Marcus could contest everything and we'd end up with nothing. I just wanted to make sure we were protected." I said, "Nikki, your name is in my will. You have always been in my will. You did not need a forged document. You needed to ask me directly." She said, "I thought you'd say no." I said, "To what? To a conversation about your inheritance with your name already in my will?" I would have said yes to that conversation any time in the last 3 years. Daniel said, "Pedro." I said, "Daniel, the mechanic's lien will be withdrawn by the end of next week, or I will file a complaint with the California Contractors State License Board and refer the matter to the Fresno County District Attorney." The beneficial interest declaration will be rescinded by the same deadline, or I proceed with the forensic report in civil court. Those are the terms. He looked at Nikki. She was looking at the table. He said, "Understood." I looked at my daughter. I said, "Nikki, I love you. I have loved you for 41 years, and I am going to love you until I die. But what you participated in here was a crime. I am not going to report it because you are my daughter, and because I believe you were frightened, and because I believe Daniel's influence in this was larger than your own judgment. But I need you to understand what it was." She was crying quietly. She nodded. I said, "We are going to have a real conversation about the estate and about Cambria and about what happens when I die. With Carmen present, with Marcus present, with everything written down and signed and dated and witnessed. That is how this family does things now." She said, "Okay." I said, "The lunch was good. Your mother's recipe for the rice. I've been making it the same way for 3 years." She looked up at me. I said, "You have her eyes. You always have." The mechanic's lien was withdrawn within 5 days. The beneficial interest declaration was formally rescinded 8 days after the lunch. Carmen recorded the rescission herself. 3 weeks later, Marcus flew down from Sacramento, and the 4 of us sat in Carmen's conference room for 3 hours and went through every provision of my will and every document related to the properties and the charitable provisions. Everything was explained. Everything was discussed. Nothing was left ambiguous. Nikki said very little during that meeting. Daniel said even less. Marcus asked good questions. Carmen answered them precisely. At the end of the meeting, I had a new will, a family trust that held both properties, and a letter of instruction that described in plain language what I wanted to happen and why. Every person in that room received a copy. Marcus called me that evening from Sacramento. He said, "Dad, did you know about all of this before the lunch?" I said, "I knew for 6 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "6 weeks, and you never said anything to me?" I said, "I needed to understand the full shape of it before I said anything to anyone. And I needed to give your sister the chance to come to me herself before I acted. She didn't take it. That was her choice, but I wanted to give her the chance." He was quiet again, longer this time. He said, "Was it Daniel? Was it his idea?" I said, "I believe the structure was Daniel's. I believe the fear was your sister's. I don't think those two things can be fully separated from each other at this point, and I'm not sure it would help anything to try." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine. The house is fine. The trust is set up correctly and everything is documented and nothing can move without my authorization. I am fine." He said, "Mom would have known 6 weeks earlier." I said, "Your mother would have known before the document was filed." He laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh fully and without reservation since Elena passed. It was the laugh from his childhood, the one that came from somewhere genuine and unguarded, and it was the best sound I had heard in a long time. I am 68 years old. I spent 35 years in a business built on the careful reading of documents and the understanding that the difference between what a policy says and what a person believes it says is where most of the damage lives. That lesson applies everywhere. What Nikki did came from fear. Daniel provided the mechanism, but the fear was Nikki's, and it came from watching her mother die and from the terror of imagining a future in which the things her parents had built might not be there when she needed them. That fear is understandable. What she did with it was not. You cannot protect yourself from the future by forging the past. You cannot secure your position by creating documents that say things that did not happen. The past is not a document you can revise. It is a record that already exists and that contains, if you know where to look, the precise date and time at which the truth and the claim stopped being the same thing. I know where to look. I have always known where to look. The Cambria house is still mine. The scholarship endowment runs every year in Elena's name. 3 students received awards this spring. I attended the ceremony. One of them is the granddaughter of a farm worker my father placed 40 years ago. Nikki calls every week. The calls are more careful and more honest now, which is a kind of progress, even when it is also a kind of loss. Daniel is cordial in the way of a man who has understood where the lines are and intends to stay on the correct side of them. That is sufficient. The dahlias along the south fence of the Cambria garden bloomed early this year. Elena would have had a specific name for the color. I do not have her vocabulary for those things. I just know they are the color they always were and that they came back, and that some things, if they are rooted properly, tend to persist regardless of what is happening around them. If you are a person whose child has done something that hurt you in the name of love and fear, I want you to hear this clearly. Love is not a document. Fear is not a justification. And the record does not change because someone needed it to say something different. The date is the date. It was true before the document was filed. It was true when I found it. It will be true long after all of this is finished. Tell me in the comments. Has someone ever tried to protect themselves at your expense and called it love? I want to hear from you.